Johnston Atoll is an island off to the west-southwest from Hawaii, with a fairly interesting history. The way I found Johnston Atoll was actually just by looking for an island on Google Maps to research because I was bored, and this just happened to be the very first island I zoomed in on at random. The island has been used for various interesting, albeit at times environmentally damaging and maybe even nefarious purposes since its initial 1858 U.S. claim. Let's begin with a loose covering of the geological formation. Just in case you don't know, an atoll is a coral reef that is lined with a circular ridge. The ridge can often protrude unevenly, resulting in what appears to be islands, which ring a center reef. So Johnston Atoll is really just a cluster of barely scratching the surface small islands, and is the byproduct of a complex array of Cretaceous, so that would be 69 to 86 million year old volcanic ridges and seamounts, basically plateaus of layered sediment. The reef has been subsiding in recent decades and seems to be doing so faster than the wildlife can sustain, so the future could see Johnston Atoll losing the atoll. Knowing exactly who first set eyes upon Johnston Atoll and when is difficult. It could have been spotted in the early 1790s at the dawn of the Hawaiian Kingdom, as there were British in the area at the time. It's also possible in 1796 that a ship ran aground, and this would technically be the first time, I suppose, somebody had seen it. However, it would seem that most give the official discovery to the later namesake of the island, Captain James Johnston, who discovered it on December 14th of 1807. Now, these events may be somewhat confusing, and I apologize, but since nothing really happened for half of a century, we're going to have to skip ahead to the 1850s. In 1858, Johnston Atoll would be officially claimed by the United States, and then subsequently, only about 3 months later, reclaimed by the Kingdom of Hawaii, and then annexed back to the United States so that they could harvest guano, a powerful fertilizer found on the shores thanks to the abundance of seabirds in the area. So despite the drama building for around 30 years leading up to the 20th century and the eventual implosion of the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1890s, the US maintained its presence in the area through Johnston Atoll. Getting close to the end of the century, the guano deposits had been depleted by 1893, and shortly thereafter the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown altogether and completely annexed by the United States in 1898. This would leave Johnston Atoll in US hands, but mostly not of importance. For a time. About 25 years later, Johnston Atoll was really just some island with some wildlife at this point. Nothing was particularly special about it, and nobody called it home. It wasn't even really known for anything other than just being in US hands. The potential strategical use of the island would simply lie in wait. Then, in 1926, on board the USS Tanager was the Tanager Expedition, which was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Bishop Museum of Hawaii, and together they would essentially rediscover the island. A full survey of the island had not been conducted at this point, so they pitched tents on a beach of fine white sand and observed hundreds of seabirds of a dozen different kinds, as well as lizards, hermit crabs, and insects. The reefs and surrounding shallow waters abounded with fish and other marine life. It was a beautiful little island, completely isolated from the age of man. Until June or July of 1926, when President Calvin Coolidge decided to make use of Johnston Atoll once more. He did so by signing an executive order which declared it the Johnston Island National Wildlife Refuge. The purpose was to preserve the beautiful wildlife and act as a breeding ground for the tropical birds. As nice as it sounds, there could actually be little to no effort at all to preserve Johnston Atoll's wildlife, as, ironically, the Department of Agriculture had no ships to even get to Johnston Island Refuge. So this was really just a form of categorization, I suppose, and once again the island was forgotten in the minds of most, for a time.
We knew the world would not be the same. Two people laughed. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture.
On December 29, 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the second executive order in Johnston Atoll's history, which transferred the control of Johnston Atoll to the U.S. Navy, who wanted to construct an airbase due to the far reach it would provide into the Pacific. And in 1936, rather than preserving the humble Johnston Atoll, the U.S. Navy began developing a seaplane base, an airstrip, and refueling facilities. The original mass of the island was significantly increased through mass dredging of the sediment in the reefs, which was then reused to expand the above-sea-level sections. In 1939, they began to fill out what would become Sand Island, an almost entirely man-made island in the center. And in February of 1941, Johnston Atoll was officially designated as a Naval Defensive Sea Area and Airspace Reservation. Despite military occupation, the construction of Johnston Atoll's expansion at this point was still being overseen by civilian contractors. Throughout World War II, Johnston Atoll proved crucial to the war fought in the Pacific and had a shadowed role in history. For example, on the day the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, one of the ships, the USS Indianapolis, was out of port at Pearl Harbor to make a simulated bombardment at Johnston Island, thus saving the lives of the Marines and civilians who were on board that day. However, on December 15, 1941, the atoll was shelled outside the reef by a Japanese submarine, which had been part of the initial attack on Pearl Harbor. Several buildings, including the power station, were hit, but no personnel were injured. However, additional attacks from the Japanese submarine ensued, and more shelling occurred on December 22nd and 23rd, but on all occasions, no one was hurt, and the submarine was fired back on by Johnston Atoll's coastal artillery, and finally fled. Even after the Japanese surrender in 1945, the base at Johnston Atoll was now fully operational and had been permanently inhabited now since 1936, so for almost a decade. To put it simply, we weren't going anywhere anytime soon. And in 1948, the United States Air Force assumed control of Johnston Atoll.
Cloud from the most powerful explosion ever fired rises and continues to rise, to tower over its seemingly insignificant test island. At the last hour, George's shot was changed to a daylight test because of adverse weather conditions. And we see it now, a magic ginny released from its bottle, growing larger with each passing moment, swirling, churning, boiling, a thing the likes of which has never before been witnessed. Ice caps formed and broken and formed again. From our vantage point at 13,000 feet in the nose of a B-17, the shock wave finally strikes. Causes the cameraman to lose for a time that which he follows in awe and fascination through his viewfinder. Closer and closer to the symbol of 220 kilotons of energy release.
It's important for me to mention here before we go into the longest and most complicated section of this video, which will cover the events of the next 30 years. I said earlier that there were still civilian construction contractors developing the island, and while they were possibly present during the shelling of Johnston Atoll by the rogue Japanese submarine we talked about earlier in the winter of 1941, they were replaced come the summer of 1942 by the Naval Construction Battalions. The Naval Construction Battalions would oversee the expansion throughout the rest of World War II, and going into what I have dubbed the age of post-war boredom, a joint task force of U.S. military, federal civilian employees, as well as workers affiliated with the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission, would be the primary personnel on not just Johnston Atoll, but all across the Pacific, in a wide-spanning nuclear test operation. Starting as far back as 1946, nuclear tests were already being conducted by the U.S. in the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean. Inhabitants were forcibly removed from the areas, islands, and cultures whose history is now even more obscured by not any one man, but a mass dedicated to furthering the technological advancement of the atomic era. While nuclear tests were already being conducted in the area since 1946 in Bikini Atoll, another atoll in the area, this one was actually inhabited by native families who agreed to relocate only because they believed they could return relatively soon. Obviously, residual radiation is kind of a thing. Suffice to say, these tests would eventually come to roost at Johnston Atoll, and in 1958 the Joint Task Force 7 was formed to conduct Operation Hardtack. This was a series of nuclear detonations and tests, some failures, some successes, some on Johnston Atoll, some not, and the operation took place over just under 4 months, with 35 nuclear tests being conducted. They were detonating once every 2 or 3 days, sometimes every day, from various remote islands, of which Johnston Atoll was likely just the most isolated. One of the first detonations, in fact the second detonation of the operation, was conducted on Johnston Atoll. It was even moved from Bikini Atoll because it was thought that it would be so close it could potentially blind anyone close and unsuspecting enough to look. So it was moved to the star of our show, and on July 31st of 1958, the hardtack teak lit up the night sky, even turning it blue for a time. Despite being so far away, it was seen from Hawaii that night. The ominous and emanating light persisted for up to half an hour, depending on reports. In fact, an aspect of this detonation was accidental. It was meant to explode some distance south of the island, but it exploded unexpectedly and directly above the island. The vast majority of the workforce had been evacuated the day prior, with only the fewest necessary to complete the test and accurately document it being left behind. However, the few that remained on the island at this point all covered their faces and ran for cover, knowing they could be blinded and even burned by the light. It exploded at over 40 miles into the air, and still it sunburned people below. It was 800 miles away from the nearest significant populace, and launched at midnight, and still it was seen, and still it's remembered. The third bomb was the same size as the second, however a correction was successfully made, as this time it did detonate 25 miles south of Johnston Atoll, and not directly above. And you'll see why later, but the name of this one was, ironically, Orange. When the booming summer of 1958 was finally over, they had tested airdrop, balloon, barge, dry surface, high altitude, and underwater detonations with a max yield across the entirety of the season being 9.3 megatons. Not all at once, but over those 3 months. With Operation Hardtack coming to a close, Johnston Atoll, although still playing with fire, was relatively safe for now. Operation Dominic was both an immediate follow-up on the previous Operation Hardtack and a response to Russian testing also advancing at the same time. This time they had different rockets and were causing smaller explosions, starting with Starfish Prime, which had a 1.4 megaton explosion. By comparison, the previously mentioned Teak was 3.8 megatons. This did not, however, prevent 4 failures which would ultimately contaminate Johnston Island, Sand Island, and the coral reef alike, with weapon-grade plutonium and the synthetic equivalent, americium, which was, of course, discovered during the 1940s. One of the rockets also spewed off into the ocean down south, and the warhead was not recovered. But the largest of failures was Bluegill Prime in July of 1962.
Bluegill Prime had a one-of-a-kind casualty, diagnosed as a sticking fuel valve, which caused a fire at motor ignition. Both missile and warhead burned.
The process that would ensue could hardly be called cleanup and is more along the lines of stuffing everything into your backyard and just ignoring the fact you're going to make just as big of a mess again. After the Bluegill Prime had failed, the Johnston Island launch complex was heavily damaged and contaminated with plutonium. Missile launches and nuclear testing halted until the radioactive debris was dumped and soils were recovered and the launch emplacement rebuilt. This would take 3 months, and it wasn't going to necessarily make it healthy for people to be there. And despite this, it seemed that they had every intention of not only just repairing it, but building a backup so testing could resume if this happened again. In an effort to continue with the testing program, US troops were sent in to do a rapid cleanup, and you'll have to forgive my more comedic tone in my voice on this, but The way they handled this was just ridiculous. The troops scrubbed down the reviments and launch pad, carted away debris, and removed the top layer of coral around the contaminated launch pad. The plutonium-contaminated rubbish was dumped in the shallow nearby waters, polluting the surrounding marine environment. More than 550 drums of contaminated material were dumped in the ocean off Johnston from 1964 to 1965. At the time of the Bluegill Prime disaster, the top fill around the launch pad was scraped by a bulldozer and grader, and then it was dumped into the lagoon or the shallow water nearby to make a ramp so the rest of the debris could be loaded onto landing craft to be dumped further out in the ocean. An estimated 10% of the plutonium from the test device was still in the fill used to make the ramp. Then the ramp was covered and placed into a 25-acre landfill on the island during 1962 during dredging to extend the island. The lagoon was again dredged in 1963 to 1964 and used to extend the island once again, which only resulted in further spread of the contamination. So, to summarize this, essentially what they did was they scraped the surface over the top of everything else, and then later in 1963, when they were extending the island, they were dredging the reef, which was still contaminated. So, radioactive soil just kind of being scraped over the top and then redistributed. I mean, this is just so far beyond irresponsible. Program 437 would see Johnston Atoll turned into an anti-satellite missile testing station about 2 years after the Bluegill Prime disaster. Despite the local contamination, starting in 1964, the island would resume testing. Initially, the rockets still had nuclear warheads, but this caused an issue with the homing sensory, and so over time, the homing was improved and the warheads were swapped with alternate payloads in 1965 through 1966, and finally, in the late 60s, they were equipped with infrared homing and non-nuclear but still high explosive warheads. As if the radioactive contamination was not enough, Johnston Atoll was about to be subject to chemical contamination. Project 112, otherwise known as Project Deseret, is something that is so horrifying and complicated it would require a video on its own. However, to save you some time, I'm going to give you a very brushed over description. Project Deseret is named in theme with the state in which it was founded, Utah. Project Deseret was developed to conduct highly classified military research aimed at both offensive and defensive human, animal, and plant reaction to biological, chemical, toxicological, entomological, and radiological warfare agents in various combinations of climate and terrain. This included experimentations on sheep, mosquitoes, and even civilians. How does this concern Johnston Atoll, though? Well, in February, March, and April of 1965, Johnston Atoll was used by the Deseret Test Center to store and release a bacterial pathogen in biological attacks on U.S. Army and Navy vessels 100 miles southwest of Johnston Atoll. The goal was to simulate something like an anthrax attack, and the decontamination tests were also done following the contamination test. The pathogen that they used is commonly known as Q fever. It would seem they underestimated this pathogen at the time of attacking their own military with it, as it is now recognized as a fairly lethal human pathogen, but treatable with antibiotics. However, the bacterium is extremely sustainable and highly contagious, so the contamination had to have had lasting effects. Experiments were also done involving Navy ships packed with monkeys and planes equipped to spray pathogenic agents over land and ocean. It was said that just one of these tanks on a plane may have been more deadly to humans than a 10-megaton hydrogen bomb. By 1970, and unfortunately when they seem to have just got it right, anti-satellite weaponry was becoming frowned upon, and satellites were ruled as a means of verification in the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, thus culminating in the closure of the program altogether, with Program 437 officially ceasing operations August 10th of 1974. And it's a good thing because they just spent 2 years within walking distance of nearly 2 million gallons of the infamous Agent Orange. Agent Orange was brought to Johnston Atoll from South Vietnam and Mississippi on the U.S. homeland in 1972. This was because in 1970, Congress redefined the island's military mission as the storage and destruction of chemical weapons. Given that the damn place had already been irradiated and contaminated with pathogens, it would seem the motto had just become, yeah, fuck that place. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency reported that 1.8 million gallons of herbicide orange were stored at Johnston Atoll, and an additional 480,000 gallons were stored at Gulfport, Mississippi. And these were also brought to Johnston Atoll later for destruction. Leaking barrels during the storage and even spills during re-drumming operations contaminated both the storage area and the reef with herbicide residue, which contained even more toxic contaminants. So by 1973, this was hands down one of the most dangerous places on the planet, and the story is far from over. The barrels were eventually destroyed aboard a Dutch incineration ship in a large deconstruction process undergone in 1977, and afterwards in the 80s, the first full-scale chemical weapons disposal facility was constructed on the island. The island would not only remain radioactive, but see another chemical weapon left over from World War II in Germany brought to the island for destruction in the 1980s. In 1990, a chemical weapon demilitarization process was finally launched, and it would take over a decade to fully demilitarize the island. Tests were conducted to ensure the island would not become a future environmental threat. All of the chemical weapons once stored on Johnston Island were demilitarized and the agents incinerated, with the process completing in the year 2000, followed by the destruction of legacy hazardous waste material associated with chemical weapon storage and cleanup. And finally, the incineration facility was demolished in 2003, and on June 15th of 2004, the last flight out for official personnel was completed. The once most isolated, insignificant, beautiful, dangerous, and now haunted atoll in the world returned to isolation. And so, after all these years and all this research, Johnston Atoll proves to be a relentless interest and infinite rabbit hole. It has a shroud which hangs over so many aspects of the post-war military conduct of the United States. Whether justified by the competition of potential enemies, or deemed an affront against indigenous populations, the environment, and maybe even just humanity itself, I leave this up to you. The things done on this island, made up of just an old coral reef, thought to have never been seen, treaded, or wanted by anybody, It is truly astounding the tidal wave of effects felt from one of the most isolated atolls on the planet. And if there was one thing I could point to as a true beginning of the end, it wouldn't be the 1934 second executive order passing it off to the Navy. The natural habitat at that point was really not much disturbed, and the intentions much less disturbing. No, it was soon after that, when a letter, in 1939, from a collection of German physicists signed by Albert Einstein, warned Franklin Roosevelt that Germany might be on the verge of developing atomic bombs.
Yes, 1996 marks the beginning of a new era. The dysfunctional member of the alcoholic family is Exhibit. Yeah, sometimes I wonder if it's all worth my while. Exhibit stay versatile with $1 million lifestyle. And I can feel it as a child growing up. The brothers that was real and the brothers that was scared to. It's why Exhibit only roll with a chosen few. You ain't really real, I can tell when I look at you. Ease off the trigger talk, you ain't killing it, it's not affecting me.
And we see it now, a magic Ginny released from its bottle, growing larger with each passing moment, swirling, churning, boiling, a thing the likes of which has never before been witnessed. Ice caps formed and broken and formed again. From our vantage point at 13,000 feet in the nose of a B-17, the shock wave finally strikes.
Only for the money in the fame, extra large. It's a shame you only in the rap game. Only for the money in the fame, paparazzi. It's a shame you only in the rap game. Only for the money in the fame, extra large. It's a shame you only in the rap game. Only for the money in the fame. I don't need no lights, no cameras. All I got is action. Never no superstar say that for Michael Jackson. See, my composure is kept while others start to sweat. Emerging from the fog with my effed up dialogue. Trying to live high on the hog leaves you bankrupt, and people you spent it on will not give up. Now that's deep. How deep? It's deeper than Atlantis. Home of the scandalous, big bad Los Angeles, dangerous vandalist. Yo, not to be trusted. Perpetrate like you hard, not being scarred by the boulevard. Pulling on cards and saying gin as I begin, flowing like liquid. So take it to your chin. I break it down. My sound surrounds like death from the west. Put your whole city to the test. It's all in perspective. Break a 1-9 copy. This is for the people getting caught up in the paparazzi. It's a shame you only in the rap game. Only for the money and the fame. Extra large. It's a shame
Explosions, starting with Starfish Prime, which amazing name. Okay, I'm sorry, that kind of pulled me away. Okay, Starfish Prime. Fuck.